Does anyone else feel like society took a massive turn in a massively crazy direction in 2021? Like, I feel like that was just the year everyone went batshit insane. Extremist politics, both on the left and the right. I almost said the life and the right. Um, Ended up like reaching a boiling point. You had the abolish the police movement being kind of a tangential facet of the broader BLM movement, which, being as decentralized as it was, didn't really have any specific demands or points that it was organizing around besides just kind of a vague notion of Black Lives Mattering, which basically everybody believes. The question then would be, well, how do we create systems that ultimately show that that is true? The systems that are emblematic of that fact, that treat those lives as though they do matter. Um, and I don't think there were any particular demands being made. I mean, in particular, the abolish the police faction, when you asked most of the people who supported BLM, they wouldn't have claimed to supported that policy or defunding the police more broadly. These were pretty fringe policies that the media latched onto and tied to the entire movement because they were the most vocal group asking for anything. Like, in general, they didn't really have demands because it was so decentralized, and a lot of those protests and the subsequent riots that followed were also filled with people who didn't even care about the issues being advocated for. A lot of those rioters literally just wanted to steal stuff, and so the notion that this was like this huge grassroots movement with a specific agenda just seems a little silly to me when there wasn't much of one even being proposed in the first place, much less an organizational structure to push for such a thing. But this was how it was presented in the right-wing media. And in response to all of that unrest occurring, you had people drifting further and further to the right. I mean, it didn't help that we had an extremely divisive president at the time who was not really moving in the direction the wind was blowing. He was more so attempting to put fuel onto the fire. Everybody remembers that stunt where he tear gassed literally peaceful protesters who were outside the White House so he could do a photo op holding up a Bible. Like, it's not exactly the kind of leadership that you want to have in a crisis like that. A populist bomb thrower, I think in the United States, tends to be someone who gets elected when it's not in a time of crisis, but there's like some general stagnation or issues that need to be addressed, and so the people will go, let's just try some random fucking thing because you know, we're comfortable here, right? And it seems like candidates in the US that are advocating for stability, for getting people back on track, a return to normalcy, tend to do better in times of crises, and I think that's why the widespread unrest surrounding racial issues were a huge contributing factor to Biden ultimately winning. But he won, and what was left in the wake of Trump and in the wake of these various social unrests that occurred throughout that year was something very extreme. Like, we ended up having a very galvanized population that moved further and further down the rabbit hole that they were already in. Like, you would look at the discourse online, or even many of the people in your own neighborhood, and they moved so far to the right or so far to the left that, like, it would be almost indistinguishable from the person you might have known before. And this was like a seismic shift in the discourse, I think, a real paradigm shift. And I think it was a sort of mass schizophrenia that occurred due to everyone having to be locked up in the house, due to the horrendous messaging that surrounded COVID-19. I think the public health officials who were put in place to keep us safe were flip-flopping quite a lot, and as the data was coming in, we were being updated on the data, but at the same time they did that, they also lied about things we already know. Like, they said that masks don't work. We know that masks work. They've worked since the Spanish flu. And they said that because they didn't want there to be a shortage of them for health officials. There were spurious and surreptitious claims made about the vaccine that new studies have since come out and rectified. It looks like it's a lot more complicated of an issue than those claims made by the CDC and other institutions initially suggested. And so there was all of this competing information, and the contradictions by these institutions themselves didn't help with that. It also didn't help that in our response to the pandemic, we had the president going out and doing a press conference every single day addressing it, at the same time that we had figures from the CDC and our top infectious disease expert also doing their own press conferences and interviews. So we didn't really have one figure who we rallied around for information. It was just kind of a free-for-all, and this was all the while people on the progressive left were making suggestions about whatever vaccine would come being like the Tuskegee experiments. They suggested that it would be weaponized against black people. They also suggested that if it were made under President Trump, that it could have these huge long-term side effects, which we now know, as it bears out through the data, that was not the case. Biden gets in there, and he's really in charge of the vaccine rollout, the push to get more people vaccinated, and then all of a sudden the vaccine is no longer associated with Trump, but with Biden. And this creates a whole new wave of polarization from the other side. And I can't help but look at all of this and feel like the economic fallout that occurred in the wake of the virus, but also all of the extra time that we had cooped up in our house, literally for months. In some places, it was like half a year, right? It gave us so much time to be getting our politics not just from the TV news or the radio or like some of the Facebook friends that we would have, but from hours and hours of TikToks that have an algorithm that are going to show you the most extreme content afterwards because it leans toward the stuff that you've already been looking at. And you got so much free time, you're just going to keep going and going and going. Same with YouTube, same with Twitter, same with Facebook, same with Instagram. And so you had all of these people consuming this alternative media, much of which was not fact-checked, much of which was not factual, and it was put out there with often like very emotionally charged language, a very manipulative framing of information. And I think this was like the perfect storm to create a situation where you had all these extremists running around and they wanted to dedicate themselves to a cause because they had nothing else going on. They were so bored that in order to not Epstein themselves, they needed to go out and do something. You know, now they had these new ideologies that they convinced themselves of, or they went even more extreme in the direction they were already in, and they felt like they were a part of something, that they were making big moves in history, watching it not just watching it play out, but being active participants in the development of history. You know, people felt really big, and they felt like their ideas were really big because their ideas were really extreme. And I think that was, in the short term, it was just a cure for boredom, right? It was just a way for these people to express themselves or fill in their time while they were bored inside the house all the time. They didn't really know what else to do because they've been working their whole lives or going to school their whole lives. They didn't have a frame of reference for what you're supposed to do in these situations. And maybe they thought, oh, I can go outside or I can go see friends, except there were strict lockdown rules in place and encouragement from all over the place saying you have to quarantine. And so a lot of people did, they did their patriotic duty and quarantined and didn't go to public places and used delivery whenever they could. They took so many precautions, but it put people in a state of isolation, many of whom were not able to get the mental health care that they needed because those places closed up shop, or the people working there were placed on administrative leave. If they were addicts, they weren't able to get the help they were already getting for addiction, and then they were put into a state of isolation and relapsed. It was like the perfect storm for people to just go nuts. Like, everyone just went nuts. And that's why I say it was mass society getting mass schizophrenia, because in the short term, it was to ameliorate, the immediate environment. But in the long term, those things that they did, those vices that they had to get through the day, had much, much more long-lasting impacts on themselves and the world around us today. And so now we see remnants of that extremism in our politics, primarily on the right. On the left, it's a little different, because as a result of those extremist calls for defunding or abolishing the police and all of the violent radical action that was taken in advocating for those things, we saw a wave of moderate Democrats winning the mayorship in extremely progressive cities. I'm talking the most progressive cities in the country. Seattle, Chicago, New York. There's a broad trend now of getting these very, very moderate, basically right-wing Democrats into office for mayor in these traditionally extremely progressive cities. And it is in direct response to all of the violence and rioting that was done on political lines during that BLM movement. And it's in response to those extremist claims that were embraced by much of the progressive left at the time. And so, if it's not people directly believing all of the crazy extremist stuff that was being pushed for during that time, then it's the ripple effects of the fact that people did believe that at some point, where now, because that stuff was treated as a serious part of the discourse, it's done major harm to not just the discourse, but also the world around us. What with the election of these right-wing Democrats in these progressive cities that are frankly doing a terrible job, and they're most likely going to be voted out when the next election cycle comes and people realize that this kind of politics was not being embraced in those cities for a reason. But it also stands to reason that there's going to be some damage done in the meantime, and that this is ultimately a result of the progressive left embracing those deeply radical elements which came to prominence due to this isolation in the society.